welcome to our first ever podcast slash vodcast here on the String Educators Workshop. And my guest today is Dr. Jared Rawlings, who is a proud University of Michigan alum. Jared, what year did you graduate?
I graduated in 2015.
2015, which dates me even more. But Jared is currently an associate professor of music education and associate director of the School of Music at the University of Utah, where he's teaching instrumental music and foundation of music education courses at both the undergrad and graduate level. And he supervises music education research there. And in addition to his teaching responsibilities, Jared serves as the music education area head and director of undergraduate studies. So quite busy. And Jared is here today with us because I learned probably a couple years now of your interest in Elizabeth Green, who and I, of course, am interested in Elizabeth Green a great deal because she's a legendary string educator, but also because I hold her former position at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance, and I have many instruments that she purchased for our program in our collection still. And so I thought it might be really interesting for our workshop participants to learn a little bit more from you about Elizabeth Green and her importance to the string education field. So I thought maybe we could just start with just you telling us a little bit how you came to be interested in Elizabeth Green and why you did the research project on her.
Of course. Well, first, thank you very much, Dr. Hopkins, for the invitation to share a little bit about this. I hope it'll be interesting to your workshop attendees. There's just so much to talk about with Elizabeth Green. I first came across her name when I enrolled in our conducting course at Baldwin Wallace University. That's where I did my undergrad. And we used her text, The Modern Conductor, and it was probably in either the sixth edition at that point. But that was the first time I really understood or read the name Elizabeth Green. And so fast forward a few years to about 2013, probably about a decade after that, I was in a qualitative research course. And a component of that qualitative research course at the University of Michigan was to have a historical unit or to explore papers from our Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan. And so Dr. McCarthy gave me a choice between the Bill Ravelli papers or the Elizabeth Green papers. And I was interested in conducting pedagogy for my master's degree. And so I chose that route to go, and which included taking a trip to Bentley Historical Library to go through her papers, so to speak, her boxes of materials. And I'll talk a little bit more about what was in those materials a little bit later. But ultimately, when we're going through these materials and papers, we were to propose a research study that you could conduct given the materials you had available to you. And so getting here to the University of Utah in my second year, it always kind of annoyed me or bothered me, I would say, more than anything, that I never completed that proposal, or that proposal left incomplete. And so because of her significant contributions, I decided to kind of take a little bit more look at it and to start accomplishing that research that I had proposed back at the University of Michigan.
Wow, great. So that's, yeah, the Bentley Historical Library's got some amazing materials in it.
Yes.
And I hope that some of the grad students who are watching this might have the opportunity to take advantage of that at some point. I know that things are probably locked down right now, but hopefully we'll be able to get those open by the fall. So So what, tell us about the sources. What sources did you use for your research? Because I know you used the Bentley, but you also had some additional sources that you brought in, right?
Yes, I did, sir. The papers really served as the initial data to design and generate an interview protocol um, with primary and secondary informants. I'll talk a little bit about who those people might be and why they were classified that way in a little bit. But these papers, we call them the Elizabeth Green papers, but what's in these boxes? And there's three legal size boxes that contain paper artifacts. Um, and the ones specifically that were germane to this study were her course syllabi. So courses that she taught in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The course examination, so she had her final examination for like teaching string instruments and also for her violin classes. Those were there as well. Some clinic notes, whenever she would hand write her notes, those were there. And if you've never had the opportunity to read cursive from the early half of the 20th century, it takes a toll on your eyes. We're just so programmed to reading text on a screen now. Reading handwriting is a whole different cognitive load issue. Um, she has non-published writings on instrumental pedagogy and conducting. There are bound handwritten books, notebooks, ledger books of just notes about her upcoming clinics at maybe Ohio State or when she served as a guest clinician there, and also the Midwest Clinic as well as there's over 50 published articles on instrumental music teaching and also correspondence from her former students and with her teacher from Russia, Nikolai Malko, and one of her primary violin teachers, Ivan Galamian. So in addition to this archive, there's dozens of photographs of Green throughout her teaching career. There was also some reel-to-reel audio that we had University of Utah funded to digitize. So they're now available on MP3 of her 1978 guest lecture at the University of Connecticut on instrumental music education, as well as an audio recording of her teaching a conducting class. So it's exciting to have those kinds of artifacts available to investigate. And not only did the artifacts inform the creation of this detailed interview protocol, but the artifacts were used to stimulate memories and of her pedagogy and her classroom practice with the informants. And so I looked at a few different sorts of informants with understanding the people who were kind of close to her and then those people who were a little bit more removed. So I'm talking about former students that had her in her collegiate classes, as well as a couple of students who were in her Ann Arbor High School orchestra for her first couple of years of teaching. They're still alive and willing to chat about her. And then we had other people who were more kind of, I don't want to say cursory, but had less interaction with her during her life, maybe through a workshop or took lessons with her, but only a couple of them. And so we kind of had this outer ring, so to speak, of secondary informants that were kind of corroborated evidence from those primary people who were in her life. She passed. She passed in 1995, and so it's something that using these informants to try to recollect of what she was like and what made her teaching so special. That was the only way to go really about this journey. So is any kind of clarifying questions before I continue, Dr. Hopkins?
No, that's great. I think maybe, I mean, you know, since you've how many different people did you interview? How many primary informants did you
So
have?
I have 10 people that served in the primary capacity, and I have 12 people that served in the secondary capacity. So I found 10 people who had a long-term engagement with her. So, and also I can share their names because, and that was part of the interview process, that their names would not be redacted or a pseudonym would not be assigned because of the nature of historical research. And that kind of falls in line with what it is. So Daniel Long was
Right.
one of the primary informants. And he was never officially her student, but spent a lot of time and really would consider Elizabeth a close friend of his. As well as I interviewed Janice Clark. She's a former faculty member at the University of Michigan who still lives in Ann Arbor. I interviewed former faculty member and director of bands, H. Robert Reynolds, who is still living in Ann Arbor. These are her former students. Bob Phillips, that's a name that probably a lot of your string workshop people will recognize. Yeah. And Michael Afsharian, I think from Shar Music, was another human that I talked to, as well as, oh, now it's her last name's escaping me, but she was the principal cello in Elizabeth's Ann Arbor High School Orchestra. Alice is her first name, and the last name's escaping me. But Michael was principal violin, and Alice was principal cello, and so they had some fun memories to share about Elizabeth Green as well. So those are some of the primary informants.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, you know, when I came to the U of M in '94, Paul Lehman was the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies, and that was the year that NAFME released the national standards, right? And they held a symposium on the national standards in I think it was 94 or 95, might have been early 95, and Elizabeth Green came to one of the sessions with Dan Long, and that was the only time I ever heard her speak. Mm-hmm. And I remember somebody asking her, you know, well, what do you think the future looks like for music education? And she said, I don't care, or something like that. She was like, that's not for me to figure out. That's for you, all of you, to figure out. And then sure enough, she passed within the year. So yeah, but it was wonderful to have the opportunity to see her that one time. But anyway, maybe you could tell us a little bit about her early years and where she grew up, went to college, her first teaching position, how she came to become a string educator in the first place.
Sure. So we talked about when she passed. It was September, mid to late September '95. But she was born in 1906. August 21st was her birthday, and so a lot of times people will see the name Elizabeth A.H. Green, and her middle initials were a middle name, which is Adine, A-D-I-N-E, as well as like a family given name from her maternal, which is Herkimer. So Elizabeth Adine Herkimer Green is her name. And it was important for her parents to give her that family name in addition to the Green because of her maternal family history. There's a couple of nuggets of information about in the biography that Deb Smith wrote, which was her dissertation in 1986, that discusses her mother's lineage being all the way back to a Revolutionary War general in 1777, where her relative, General Herkimer, went and conquered the British at Fort Stanwix. So very interesting kind of lineage as far as her name is concerned. But she was born in Mobile, Alabama. And at the age of 2, her mother and father moved her back to Blue Island, Illinois. And that's just a suburb kind of on the southwest side of Chicago. And her father was a very accomplished violinist, performer turned teacher because of a performance injury. And Elizabeth referenced this as kind of a paralysis of sorts that he experienced. But he started teaching her violin at age 4. And then Green went later after some primary school years to study with the concertmaster of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, Jacques Gordon was his name, and then also onward to Ivan Galamian. In addition, during her school years, there's a very rich biography written, like I mentioned, by Deb Smith about her early years, and it talks about what years she moved to what other suburban Chicago town, but ultimately she was always taking a part of music, whether it's school-based music or independent violin study. with different people. She also took cello and bass lessons as well. After her high school years, she went to Wheaton College, and that's where her father became the director of the School of Music in the 1920s. And so when she started at Wheaton College, it talks about her studying, meaning her biography discusses her studying, in addition to music and violin, being a philosophy minor, as well as studying French as well. Kind of a fun fact that I did not know until very recently was that while she was studying violin, she was also teaching violin at Wheaton College. So as an undergrad, her father hired her to teach violin lessons in addition to her taking violin lessons. So I'm sure that wouldn't fly in this day, but kind of an interesting idea, as well as she was in her last year there teaching French. She was a French instructor as well. So teaching was always kind of in her blood or in her bones. She was always kind of interested in doing it. And I would say before really, I mean, she, according to our standards, should have been doing it. But she's kind of a voracious learner and a voracious reader, and it kind of speaks to her disposition a little bit too, especially when you listen to her audio recordings and her talk, that she is very serious about what she does, and she's very dedicated to it. In 1928, when she graduated from Wheaton, she was offered 2 teaching positions. She was offered a teaching position at Morningside College in Sioux City, Iowa, as well as a position in East Waterloo Public Schools in Iowa as well. She chose to be in Waterloo because she wanted to be closer to her parents. They were moving back to Chicago proper, and she wanted to be near them as they were getting a little bit older. From 1928 to 1942, she was in Waterloo. She started as an assistant to Grover Bennett, who was the fine arts supervisor, but also the orchestra director, orchestra head conductor of the junior high and the senior high. Had about 90 string players. She recounts having mixed instrumentation, E-flat flutes, heckelphone, which is kind of a bass flute, I guess you would maybe equate it to today, sarrusophones, which those are brass instruments, but with a double reed mechanism to make sound. So she was teaching kind of everything, and instruments that we don't even know about today because they're not in our orchestras, or at least our modern orchestras at the moment. But in addition to assisting those orchestras, both the junior high and the senior high, she taught 50 private lessons each week. In addition to, so she liked to stay busy. In 1932, about 4 years after her going to Waterloo, she took over for Grover Bennett and became the director of orchestras, and also adding to her 50 lessons a week, 5 elementary string classes at each different elementary school that fed the junior high. If that wasn't enough for her to do, I'm tired just thinking of her doing all that. She was also a member of the Waterloo Civic Symphony Orchestra that she was also on the board for. So that kind of takes care of the Waterloo, Iowa days before she came to Ann Arbor. And she was familiar with Ann Arbor before she arrived for her job. In 1941, in August, her and 3 other traveling companions went to the Gordon String Quartet School. And as they were driving back from New York, they stopped in Ann Arbor. And she recalled in Deborah Smith's biography, just being struck by the overall beauty of Ann Arbor, the trees, and thinking that this would be a place that she'd like to work someday. And lo and behold, later that year, a teaching position became open in Ann Arbor, which was a dual position between Ann Arbor public schools as well as the University of Michigan. And that was common at that time. So she interviewed with David Mattern from the School of Music, and also Otto Hazley from Ann Arbor Public Schools in Chicago. They interviewed her in Chicago in the spring of 1942. And that's all she wrote. That's when she went to Ann Arbor, and she started her joint position both with the public school system and the University of Michigan. Just kind of speaking to her public school teaching before we transition to the university teaching, she she worked with Ann Arbor Public Schools um, from fall 1942 until about 1953. She started to ask for a reduction of load from Ann Arbor Public Schools so she could take on more teaching at the university level. And at 1953, so about 11 years after her arrival, she was only teaching at Eber White Elementary School, those elementary string classes.
Wow.
Um, so in 1956, she resigned from Ann Arbor Public Schools. And so she taught not only at Ann Arbor High, but also Slauson Junior High School, which is just outside of downtown Ann Arbor.
Right.
That kind of takes care of her early teaching career, both Waterloo and Ann Arbor. And then alongside that, the last decade of her teaching at Ann Arbor, she started teaching at the University of Michigan. So.
Wow. Yeah. So before she started, so yeah, wow. So that's great. So she was able to juggle that. Now that the Ann Arbor High School, that was back when that was on East. Was that the school on East University where the School of Education is now?
Right, the lab, well, didn't they have a lab school at some point in the 70s? Yeah, but it's that building. I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was that building. So,
But that was actually, so and that was, I'm guessing that predated Pioneer High School in Ann Arbor. That was
correct.
before Pioneer. Wow. Amazing. So she's at the University of Michigan,
Mhm.
and this is the days of William Ravelli
Yeah.
teaching band, and and she was, I've always wondered, like, because now we're so everybody's in their own department and everything, but I know she taught what we think of now as music ed courses, but she also taught conducting too,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
And so tell us a little bit about what all she did at the University of Michigan, where what
Sure.
she was involved with.
So I mentioned a couple of times that she did have this joint appointment. When she had finally given up the Ann Arbor Public School part of her teaching position and they just made her full time at the University of Michigan, she had completed 28 years of public school teaching experience between Waterloo and Ann Arbor, which
Wow.
is, I would say, unusual in these days. That to have 28 years of public school teaching experience, then before becoming full time, is odd, but she brings a lot to this position. And so she did join U of M in 1942 as an instructor. And so she remained an instructor, which is not a tenure track position, but as we need a course covered or a course taught, would you please go ahead and do that? And between 42 and 1948, she was on the books in 1942, but never really taught a course according to our bulletin until 1944. So even though they had her on the books, she didn't start for the University of Michigan until 44. And that was confirmed through records management and the bulletin to know when she first started teaching. And those classes were music ed, just like you said, but some of the examples of those courses were she was supervising some student teachers specifically for the instrumental music area. She also taught some summer courses, like in 1945, she taught a rehearsal techniques a course for string teachers. She taught a class called Materials for Instrumental Organizations. I'm trying to think, that might be more of like an administration class or some sort of a curriculum class, as far as I can tell. She taught conducting courses, of course, both levels, both for just like a beginning level or an entry level conducting movement course to then a more advanced one. She taught instrumental methods as well as violin classes or string methods. And so that was mostly between 1949 and 1957 when she was an assistant professor of music education. So she was, I guess, what we would call a promotion from the instructor level to then the assistant professor level. And she had that position for about 8 years, and then she became an associate professor. She was tenured and promoted to that level in 1957, and then a few short years later, she was granted full professor status in 1963, all teaching these classes. She did retire from the University of Michigan in 1975 with emeritus status with the University Regents, and they quote saying at her retirement news release that Green attained national and international distinction in two fields of musical endeavors, one teaching of string instruments and the other teaching of conducting. So to receive that kind of distinction from the University of Michigan Regents and to also be granted emeritus status signifies, I would say, her legacy and influence on the profession.
Yeah. Well, the other thing she did that really I felt like had a lot of influence on the profession was the her large number of publications.
Oh, yeah.
And you know, you spoke earlier about her study with Ivan Galamian.
Mm-hmm.
I learned many years ago that his book on violin play, I can't remember the exact title, violin playing and teaching.
Oh, principles? No.
Principles of violin
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
playing, that she actually was the ghostwriter of on that book for him. So when did she first? Do you know when she first met him? And is this at Meadowmount where she first connected with Ivan Galamian, or?
So I don't know if that's where she's first connected with him, but I do know that's where she went. I think there was like 5, 6 summers that she would travel to Meadowmount to take lessons with him,
Yeah.
violin. And there's a story through one of these interviews that came forward about the whole Meadowmount journey, that her car broke down. And then she had a typewriter in the back, and as her car was being serviced for 2 days, she wrote the book. I'm not sure how, I mean, that's someone's recollection,
Yeah.
you know, of what happened. But yeah, she was the ghostwriter for that book. I don't know when they first were introduced. I know it's documented somewhere, I just can't recall.
Do you know what years that was that she was at Meadowmount? What was it? Are we talking like the 1940s or?
I think it was later, but I don't have the date in front of me. I'd have to confirm it. I do have it. I just don't remember it.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember when Ivan Galamian started the Meadowmount thing, because that became this legendary place for violinists to go spend the summer, and then after, Dorothy DeLay, of course, who was a student of Galamian's, she got involved up there. And I know when my wife was in college and undergrad, she went to Meadowmount for a summer.
Oh, wow.
And there was this, just really kind of magical feel to it up there. And so maybe tell us a little bit about the publications that you feel that have had the most impact on the profession that she was involved with.
Sure. I mean, in addition to the book that you already mentioned, The Principles of Violin Playing and Teaching, and we talked about the modern conducting text. There's a couple other texts that she wrote, or a series of books that she wrote that I think would be germane to your audience. The string pedagogy specifically, there's the orchestral bowings and routines text.
Yeah.
I remember using that in my string methods class to have a bowing quiz, and it was interesting to see some of the rules and some of the presentation of the bowings. As a percussionist, I think a lot about stickings and sticking choices, and there's some interesting principles that overlap between the two. So, and also there's this, the teaching string instruments in classes, 1966, I think was the publication date on that. I don't know if they're out of print yet, but those are two string ped books that I think could be useful to your audience. There's also, I'm not sure if you've seen it yet. I've never seen it. I've always been interested, but Theodore Presser published these musicianship and repertoire series for high school orchestra. I don't know if you've seen those or not, but
I have not. No.
I've always I've always been curious. It's like a method book for high school. And so I wish I could get my hands on a set, but those are out of print. So
Yeah. I can tell you that teaching string instruments in classes, that 1966 book, it's a very thin book. You know, it was part of a series of music education pedagogy manuals they put out at the time, and boy, it's just got a lot of great information in there.
yeah.
And one of her ideas that I just thought was really great was the how you introduce the instruments to kids. And her whole thing was, you do not let them take the instrument home or open the case unsupervised until after the 10th lesson. And she's got it all laid out, the first 10 lessons. And her point is like, what are they going to be doing with the instrument at home when they don't know how to hold it right, or you know, how to tighten the bow yet? And so it's actually really well written, and yeah, it's a great book, and you know, she really was a pedagogical giant, I would say. Do you know? You know, I'm just for my own curiosity. You know, what were you able to learn about her teaching and how she approached,
Sure.
you know, teacher education and preparing people to become teachers? And you know, I mean, any thoughts that you've gained along the way from the informants on that?
Yeah. So before, when you were describing, she had 10 lessons before you would even let the student take home the instrument. I was laughing because you've met her and you know how she was and how direct she was, and listening to her teach. It all falls in line with how regimented she was. She had a system and a sequence and a developmental process for how to teach and for what. And so I think not only was what I learned about her pedagogy, but it was also through the interview process, understanding her and her, I don't want to say relational capacity, that term is used in teacher ed right now, but her ability to deliver the message was very unique. I would consider Elizabeth Green one of the pioneer music teacher educators. She was figuring out how to do it before we started studying that area or that field of study, if you want to consider that a field of study. But her creation of the first conducting pedagogy program of study, or the conducting sequence that you would take in collegiate, was a marker, I guess, of why I would consider her a pioneer music teacher educator. And the framework that she would provide, the regimented approach to how we study this field, really, I don't want to say standardized the approach, but it was I guess, a standardizing tool. So I guess these interviews have generated some insights. Like I had mentioned a little bit about her pedagogy, but when I talked about the relational capacity, I would play excerpts of her teaching for the informants to listen to. What did she mean by this? How did she mean this to you? What was this important to you? During H. Robert Reynolds' interview, he talked about her as a figure, almost a maternal figure. He used the reference of kind of an endearing title, Ma Green. And that was something that they would never say to her face, but would always use kind of behind the scenes as a term of endearment because of her vested interest that she took in each of their development. H. Robert Reynolds said, quote, "You never wanted to disappoint her because she always took an interest in getting to know us as individuals. She was the best teacher of anything in my entire life," end quote. So to have someone who is, at least in the conducting of the CBDNA, College National Band Directors Association world, to be, I don't want to say a heavy hitter, but he is someone that is that keeps busy himself. He is sought after for workshops and clinics all the time. And for him to say that this person was the human in his life that made an impact is something to not ignore. And his ability to capture what she did, to build relationships with them, to show interest, affected his conducting appearances whenever he was in class, but also his pedagogy as well. I mentioned a little bit earlier too that that she was a voracious learner, very active. When she retired in 1975, she began another degree, a BFA in art from Eastern Michigan, and she was quoted as saying, "You can't teach what you don't know." And she was very interested in figuring how to teach art. And so she took lessons. She supplied art sometimes for some of the buildings at the University of Michigan as well. I don't know where those are now. I know a few of her former students or friends have a few of those pieces. But it just kind of talks to a little bit about how she was and who she was. Everything had a place, a sequence. She was a fierce diagnostician. Just movement wise, she could look at you and figure out what needed to be fixed with movement, and then how to convey that was really something special that she did as well. Maybe why she is so well thought of, or and in certain instances loved by many of her former students and colleagues.
Yeah, sounds like she's able to fix them
Yeah.
pretty effectively, which is great. And that's, that's, I think, the hallmark of a great string educator is somebody who can immediately spot what the challenge, what the problem is, and how immediately to fix it, and get good results. So yeah, that's great. Any other, parting thoughts that you have that you learned from doing this research on Elizabeth Green that you'd, like to share with our string education community here at the workshop?
I, you know, I'll say this: moving out to the mountains, Mountain West, the Intermountain region of our country, the name Elizabeth Green is not, I would say, universally understood. And I guess I took that for granted, being in the Midwest or being a string teacher myself, and knowing of her work and understanding not only the string instrument pedagogy or pedagogical work that she did, but also the conducting. And I wonder about, her time and her place. If she had lived in a different time, maybe if she lived now, what would her impact be? And I mean, she was a giant on the East Coast in the Midwest, and knowing her reach was, it's hard to make impact in several areas. And the fact that she did it not only in string education, but or string instrument teaching, but also in conducting, is unique, I would say.
Yeah, I
I,
think
I would, oh, go ahead, sorry.
oh no, I was just going to say she's one of the handful of faculty you can think of in the history of the University of Michigan
Mm-hmm.
School of Music that, there's Ravelli, of course, and then right, I think next on the list is Elizabeth Green,
Mm-hmm.
and these were the people who built this house,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I still benefit from her work to this day in that, we still have 2 semesters of string techniques here. And I think Elizabeth Green was largely responsible for laying that groundwork. She just, there, string education is, if you look around the Ann Arbor area, right,
Mm-hmm.
there's this perimeter around the Ann Arbor area where there's, a long history of string programs. And so I think that I think it's great that ASTA continues to honor her legacy by awarding, giving an award to a teacher, an excellent public school teacher every year at the national conference. So I think that that's great that they're doing that, and that hopefully will help to preserve her legacy.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you so much
Sure.
for sharing uh, your research with us today.